100 years ago on the day of this video's upload, an event that became almost mythic occurred. An event known for its horror, its apocalyptic destruction, and the terror of the unknown. An event that caught even the most weather-wise by surprise, and was made only worse by the lack of a proper warning system to let people know it was coming, and by the fact that the weather had been predicted, by what weather prediction there was at the time, to be the opposite of what actually occurred on that day. Something roared across the Midwest 100 years ago, shrouded in a cloud of black, rolling fog. It crawled and shredded its way across 3 states, earning itself a name that would be seared into history. Incredibly, a gap in the clouds opened up at the exact location of the sun. For a short spell that neither of us will ever forget, the entire vault of black and purple clouds were lit from beneath, as if the world was on fire. The view toward the north, where what remained of the tornado dangled like a ghostly gray rope, was like a foretaste of the apocalypse. Introduction to the Tri-State Tornado by Peter S. Felknor. On March 18th, 1925, during the midday to afternoon hours, the deadliest tornado in United States history tore a path across 3 states. Many people did not even realize that it was a tornado. It was described as a black rolling cloud of fog that swept in, and by the time people realized, it was too late. I remember first hearing about this tornado for the first time in the early 2000s. It was like 2nd grade. My elementary school library had a book about tornadoes, and it hooked me. And now here we are, 100 years later to the day that it happened. It's almost surreal to think about. Even back then, I knew 1925 was almost a century ago, but here we finally are. So, for this long time coming anniversary, I'm going to tell you the story of the Tri-State Tornado and the people it affected and the legacy it still carries today. Today we will be discussing the story, the lingering mysteries and debate on if it was one long-track tornado or a family of tornadoes. Personally, I am in the camp that it was one long-tracked tornado, but I will share what we know and let you make your own decision on what you think later in the video. This is the United States tornado of near legend, the beast that is still spoken of today, the tornado that still has secrets we haven't discovered, the one many yearn for even a photo of so we can imagine it. The terror of 3 states that struck 100 years ago today that, in its aftermath, left fires raging, lootings, and mass theft, and a trail of eviscerated wreckage and mangled, torn apart bodies. The 1925 Tri-State Tornado. As Peter S. Felknor's book describes it, at midnight on March 17th, things suddenly began to go awry. An unusually powerful surge of moisture-laden air from the Gulf of Mexico had spilled out of the Mississippi Valley into the high plains, angling due northwest on a collision course with the center of low pressure. Just before dawn on March 18th, parts of Kansas were visited by violent weather that may or may not have involved a tornado, but certainly did involve winds strong enough to cause considerable damage. A 6-year-long study into the background of the storm that brewed up the infamous monster was published in 2013, giving us invaluable information into the conditions that led to the storm and the tornado itself. It found that the late winter to early spring months of 1925 were warmer and drier than normal over much of the central region of the United States. March 17th of that year would prove to be a day of sinister foreshadowing of what would come the next day. As I've said it before, this was the fuse being lit. The next day would be when it reached the stick of dynamite and exploded. The pieces were scattered throughout the U.S. The extratropical cyclone that would be key to the storm was centered over Montana at 7 a.m. Central Standard Time, and at the same time, a diffuse area of surface low pressure was centered over Denver, Colorado. Oculated fronts extended from Hudson Bay in Canada down into the northern plain states where a lee trough, an elongated region of low atmospheric pressure, was hanging around. Other pieces of this puzzle included the warm front stretched along the Gulf Coast, separating warm, moist air from cooler air. There was also a mixed continental tropical air mass over western Texas and northern New Mexico, and there were even more atmospheric conditions in play and moving into place to create a perfect storm. All the pieces just lined up in a row. The fuse was now burning short. A very rare mixing and churning of ingredients was happening, something that might only happen once in an average human lifetime. A perfect, ugly storm. And now we come to March 18th. The pieces were moving by 7 a.m. on that day. Everything was coming together to form a monster, an undisturbed supercell without really any competition to sap energy from it as it built and gained strength was growing. The pieces resulted in unstable air and lower cloud bases, a good thing for tornadogenesis, which is literally the process from which tornadoes form. From Kansas to Kentucky and Indiana, a capping inversion was also suppressing storms throughout the area with warm air, leaving that supercell that would spawn the tri-state tornado and its family essentially all alone, and allowed it to just build and brood undisturbed. Like a monster springing up for a strike, it just kept building. Clouds cleared away from the skies, which would in a few hours be churning with the tornado. There were a lot of other meteorological factors in play, and probably more that we just don't know about. But know that these kinds of conditions just create perfect storm conditions. Everything was lining up in a way that's horrifyingly perfect and rarely seen from how I understand it. And I'm not a meteorologist, you can probably tell. I'm just a guy who likes tornadoes and is trying to explain the conditions of the day as best I can. However, the conditions of this day were not only unique, but also very complicated due to all of the factors at play that just built and built and built until finally the avalanche hit. What I can tell you, though, is after reading through all of that, is that these conditions more or less led to the supercell which spawned the tri-state tornado, forming in highly favorable conditions just ahead of the triple point where the warm front, cold front, and dry line all met. By 2 p.m. that day, the tri-state supercell was nearing the Mississippi River. As storms began striking, the tri-state cell was an isolated beast. And by 2 p.m., the tornado was already on the ground. The first fatality from it occurred just after 1 p.m. when it caught a farmer by surprise. Now, while the most well-known description of the tornado is perhaps of it as a very un-tornado-looking cloud of rolling black fog or smoke rolling along on the ground, as multiple survivors describe it, the first eyewitness description of it reported it as a highly visible small condensation funnel, which is literally just the traditional-looking tornado funnel that most people probably picture first when they think of a tornado. The tornado began near Ellington, Missouri, and the unfortunate farmer was not the only one caught off guard. What weather forecasting there was at the time had predicted the weather for the day to be normal. Heck, at the time, the word tornado was still banned in United States weather forecasting and had been since the late 19th century. Annapolis, Missouri was the first town hit. As the tornado began to move north, it plowed into the town and nearly the entire town was destroyed, as was the mining town Ladana, where 90% of structures were leveled and 2 people lost their lives. As it continued its north to northeastward track, the tornado began to grow in size into the monstrous, ominous sliding wedge it would spend most of its life as. Already, it had taken on the infamous appearance it would have for much of its life. A rolling barrel of boiling, hideous black clouds. The tornado famously was shrouded like this for much of its life. Witnesses across all 3 states it struck described it more or less with this consistent appearance, likely resembling this. The tornado may have begun as a small funnel, but by the time it left the Blair's Creek area and moved into Ellington, it went from being that to being described as this apocalyptic-sounding purple blackness rolling towards the town. Annapolis witness descriptions of the tornado described it as a black, smoky shape coming over the hills towards them, something that we'll be hearing from a lot of witness accounts today. As it gained its infamous shape, it had also already gained strength. In Bollinger County, Missouri, the tornado struck multiple schools, homes, and farms. A farmer and 3 children were killed near Luxville, and another child died a week later from her injuries. Meanwhile, 32 more children were killed in the schools. Here, the tornado also left deep ground scouring, and it carried sheets of iron as far away as 50 miles from their sources before throwing them away. The tornado was observed with 2 funnels or multiple vortices in Perry County, Missouri as well. Another farmer was killed around this time, and the tornado also struck the town of Bile. Many homes were destroyed, the church's roof was ripped off, and 4 people died here. At Brazu, another farmer suffered ultimately fatal injuries, and multiple homes and farms were leveled between there and the city of Frona. One more woman was killed by the tornado, and another died of her injuries 10 days later. At least 12 people died, and over 200 were injured in Missouri by the time the tornado exited the first of the 3 states it cut its path across. Though no pictures of the tri-state tornado are known to exist, leaving the tornado shrouded in as much mystery as it was shrouded by clouds on the day that it struck, the aftermath accounts, stories, and images paint a searing image of it. Now, unless they feature a tornado in the image, the black and white images or sepia images you are seeing throughout this video are actual images of the very well documented aftermath, unless it is explicitly pointed out otherwise. But I also have been showing modern video and pictures of tornadoes or storm damage that is similar to what was described. Again, unless it is specifically pointed out, anything that is black and white or sepia is actual images of the aftermath. Here is one of the most famous images of the aftermath of the tornado. It crossed the Mississippi River, briefly, technically, becoming a waterspout as it did, before it made landfall again and entered southern Illinois, debarking and knocking down trees and scouring the ground as it entered the state. It struck in a rural area before hitting the riverside town of Gorham at 2:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Clocks in the town were found stopped at 2:35 p.m. The town was obliterated as though a bomb was dropped on it. 60 of 80 homes, the train depot, all the stores, and 2 of the 3 schools were leveled. The 20 other surviving homes all sustained damage as well. Railroad tracks were also ripped clear out of the ground, and by the time it was done, over half the town's population was injured or outright killed by the tornado. The situation in the town was near total annihilation. 30 were killed here in the immediate aftermath. 6 to 7 more later died of their wounds. One schoolgirl later said, "We were in a classroom and suddenly got so dark we couldn't see. All the children rushed to the window. Teacher was mad. She made us go back to our seats again. All we could see at the windows was that it was black, like night almost. Then the wind struck the school. The walls seemed to fall in all around us." And about after the tornado struck and made the school collapse, she said, "We tried to get out of the school. Some of us did succeed in getting loose and out from under the stuff that was piled over us. Then our fathers and mothers came, and we got out." Moving northeast at speeds between 62 and 73 miles per hour, the tornado was cutting nearly a constant mile-wide path as it tore into more communities and cities. In some communities, the sudden night gave way again almost immediately after the tornado passed. In some cases, within 5 minutes, the sun was shining brightly out on leveled communities as survivors began crawling out of the rubble and picking through what was left. Remember, this was happening in the afternoon. Sudden night would strike like a total eclipse of the sun, and when the sun came out again, maybe in about as long as an eclipse totality lasts even, everything was destroyed by the passing black wall. After leaving Gorham, the tornado passed through a low gully, and all the grass in it was ripped out of the ground. The tornado continued rolling over the ground without slowing, already having been on the ground for 90 minutes. The city Murfreesboro, Illinois was hit shortly after 2:30 p.m., only 10 or so miles to the northeast of Gorham. And 234 people were killed here, the highest death toll of any individual community in any tornado event in U.S. history. 20 of those killed were never identified, and on top of the death toll, 623 were injured, some of whom died from their injuries. Entire rows of homes were leveled here as if they'd never even been there, completely swept away, as you can see from the image on screen now. This town of 10,000 people was wiped off the face of the earth. Unfortunately for the residents, it would be a town pinpointed again by a strong tornado a few decades later in 1957, but that is a tornado for another video. This was also the town where the infamous school picture I showed a few minutes ago was taken. That was Longfellow School in Murfreesboro, where 17 children were killed. 35 people were killed at the M&O Railroad. A Logan School was also leveled, and 9 people were killed there. And as the tornado left the town, horrifically, fire began breaking out, burning trapped survivors who had no way to escape the rubble they were buried in alive. The water main was destroyed, and there was virtually no means for the survivors to put out the what must have looked like near apocalyptic fires that began raging. It got so bad that they even tried to use dynamite to stop the fires from spreading by blowing up whatever would burn and starving the fires dry, but that only made the situation worse and caused even more destruction. Eugene Porter said the hydrants were broken off or moved out, and the firemen couldn't get any pressure. There was one fire truck that got close to the Baptist church across from my school, and it burned up there. As fires burned the ruins of the town, those not caught in the flames and collapsed buildings wandered about, many in shock, some so covered in mud that they couldn't tell who was who or identify some of the dead. Big sheets of tin were also found in this area, and where they came from, nobody knows. They may very well have been carried from the tornado all the way back from somewhere in Missouri. By the end of it, roughly 100 blocks of the city were leveled. Survivors of the storm here had some of the most harrowing stories. Myrtle Marr said, "Our neighbors next door, the roof didn't blow off, but it caved in. They had a heating stove in the living room. She, the neighbor, had 2 little boys, and when the roof collapsed, this heating stove held it up. They were right under there, and they were not injured." Opal Boren said, "My cousin's house blew off, and she dropped down by the foundation, and it saved her and her baby." Eugene Porter had a lot to say about that day. One of his accounts was this. One woman had gone to her basement, but she had a bird upstairs, and she decided to come up after it. Well, the house just shifted on the foundation, and it just pinned her and crushed her. You don't know where you're going to be where you're safe. The situation was not going to get better anytime soon either. For anywhere else still in the tornado's path, all hell was about to break loose, and some of the most horrific and destructive events of its life were about to unfold as it spun its path across the state, which, at this time, the tri-state tornado was essentially following a railroad line and striking community and town after town built along the line. The next community hit was DeSoto, and like the earlier struck Gorham, it was essentially gone, totally obliterated. Around 30% of the town was destroyed, and 33 children were killed at the DeSoto school when it collapsed. The worst tornado death toll at a single school to this day in U.S. history. State Senator F.M. Hewitt described the tornado as it roared into DeSoto as a churning gray mass with an army of debris approaching fast. The destruction in DeSoto was reportedly beyond belief. Pictures of the aftermath here are even compared to the damage the H-bombs did in Japan in 1945 in Peter's book. Some photos from DeSoto show sections of white picket fence poking out of the rubble like the bones of some giant creature. Others show the ground completely swept bare, even of foundations. Garrett Cruz said, "When I got there to my school, the power lines that were along the highway were all down, and there was fire flying everywhere, and there was men out there directing all the children to stay away from the down lines." As I recall, DeSoto had been provided with electricity for perhaps only a year or so prior to the day of the storm. A journalist who visited the scene wrote, "The town itself is virtually obliterated. Piles of brick and timbers fill the street. Trees are split and uprooted. The scene resembles that of a World War battlefield, except that on the battlefield the victims are men. Here, they are mostly women and children. Many men escaped through the fact that they were away from home, mostly at work in the coal mines. Jackson County Deputy George Boland was on patrol when the tornado struck. Witnesses reportedly saw him vanish into the foggy funnel, and he was never found. No sign of his vehicle or his body were ever located. Shortly after, the town of Hearst was narrowly missed, but the village bush was struck. The same never-ending story happened here. Homes were leveled, and the water tower was pierced with pieces of wood fired out of the tornado like bullets. 10 people died in Bush and the immediate surrounding area, and 4 more later died from injuries. As the tornado struck Bush, witnesses described the rather horrific image of a hideous black cloud with a red color in the middle of it. Myrtle Marr, who lived in West Frankfort, did too. When the rain suddenly stopped, as did the lightning, she looked outside and saw this terrible-looking cloud. It was so black that right in the center, it was sort of reddish-looking, she said. As the tornado struck Franklin County, it tore apart rural areas and killed 25 more people. Then it hit the aforementioned mining town, West Frankfort on the northwest side. The destruction here mirrored what had been seen in Murfreesboro, a picture of which is on screen now, as the tornado devoured densely packed together homes, businesses, and mining operation centers. Though the business district was largely spared since it was mainly the mines located several hundred feet below the ground. Extreme damage was nonetheless inflicted in the area east of the tornado, where a railroad trestle was torn from its supports and 300 feet of anchored down railroad was ripped out of the ground and thrown away. 102 in total died in West Frankfort, many in the immediate tornado, and 21 in the hours and days later. Men who had been working in the mines emerged to find women just simply screaming, holding maimed and crippled children in their arms. Another story from West Frankfort was the story of Layla Hartman, who had just turned 4 and was visiting her grandparents' farm 3 miles west of the city. In 1999, she recalled, "Yeah, my grandfather had died a couple of years earlier. We had gone there to spend the day with Grandma, and it was a pretty day. You know, being a little kid, I didn't pay too much attention to the weather, but as the day went on, it started looking like rain and clouding up and getting dark, and after a while my dad said, 'You know, we'd better go to the cellar.' And my grandma, no way she was gonna go, and it just kept getting darker and darker, and by the time she finally agreed to go, well, it was almost as black as night when we finally went to the cellar. And I think we got there just in time because we could hear things you didn't hear in an ordinary storm. And when we were ready to come out, my dad was a real young man then, and was strong, and he couldn't get the door open. So he worked and worked and worked, and after a while, he got it open enough he could get out. And there was a tree that had blown across the cellar door. The top from the Model T Ford the family had was also gone, which stood out to Hartman at the time. Her complete account is long, and I'll link it in the description if anyone wants to read the whole thing. This was just a small section of it. Layla Hartman visited the cellar which she sheltered in on March 18, 1925, 75 years later in 1999. The home was long sold by then, but the cellar was still there, and the owners allowed her to come and see it. Another West Frankfort resident, Myrtle Marr again, said, "My husband was working as a foreman down inside the mine. And when the tornado hit, of course it tore the top of the mine off, and the power went off, and the men had to walk out, climb out, because there was no power to run what they called the cages, the elevators. So he got his men out of the section that he was working in. Before he got out, he made sure that all his men got out. They had to climb up those steps, 10 steps, and then a turn, then another 10 steps, about 550 steps in all." The tornado passed West Frankfort in a few minutes. The sun came out shortly after, and then it snowed that night even. In some places, the temperature even dropped to 0 the night after the tornado hit. Multiple mining villages were likewise obliterated in a similar fashion to what happened in West Frankfort. At Caldwell, one of those mining villages, which was given the name 18, one the tornado essentially just cut through the center of, 24 people died, and 2 of those who were injured also later died. 2 of those who died were a mother and a baby who drowned in a nearby swamp or pond where they were found. However, horrifyingly, one single family lost 11 members. Isaac Carnes' wife, their married daughter, and her husband, a daughter-in-law, and 7 grandchildren, the oldest of whom was only 7, and the youngest was still a newborn. Opal Boren, a survivor in 18 who was in 7th grade when the tornado struck, pointed out a valley to the southwest of her old school decades later and said, "The cloud filled up that whole little valley down there." Parrish, Illinois suffered up to a 27% casualty rate and lost all but 3 buildings. The only buildings still standing after the storm were the schoolhouse, church, and one lucky home. There was no means to communicate to other towns about the mess or ask for help, and a train passing by was the only reason the catastrophic damage was discovered. Parrish was struck at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon. Survivors commented that the only sign anything was coming was the thunder and constant lightning flashes. Clarence Lohman was standing on the porch of a store he ran with his father-in-law when he saw the black whirling cloud spinning its way towards him. It was only about a quarter of a mile away, and he shouted a warning to his father-in-law before trying to run home. He was overtaken by the storm and had to cling to a rail line to keep from being blown away. The number of deaths in Parrish counted in the immediate aftermath was 46 people having lost their lives, as the town was swept off the face of the earth like so many others before it. And Clarence? Amazingly, he survived. His will was not broken by the storm, but his body was. He suffered a broken arm, some broken ribs, a spinal injury, but he held on to that rail line. The house he was trying to run to was the only one that was spared by the tornado. His family were home and survived. The store he had run from was leveled, and his father-in-law was seriously injured. One story from Parrish that deserves to be highlighted is the story of Delmar Perryman. What he did when the tornado bore down on Parrish was, when he saw everything was getting dark, he locked the doors to the school. He was the schoolmaster, and he did this and prevented any of the 50 to 60 children inside the school from leaving and running out into the storm. The tornado just missed the school, but it is likely that him closing those doors and not letting anyone leave saved many lives, since the kids couldn't flee the building. Many people who live in Parrish were actually away when the tornado hit, working in one of the Black Star Company's mines near Logan. Not all, though. William Rainey was a farmer who lived near Parrish, fortunately in the path of the tornado. His body was found more than a mile from his home in a clump of trees. He was mauled by the tornado. His neck was broken, both legs were broken, and he had even lost his right arm. Animals were likewise broken and mauled with similar cruel indifference. Dead fowl were found in large numbers amid the debris lining the area, including items such as furniture and wheels and metal objects like bedposts, and in the fields were dead, crippled, or seriously injured cows and horses. And over the scene of disaster, the wreckage, and anxious searching parties, a bright sun from among the blue skies and white clouds smiled down, ironically, wrote Arthur Schneff. In total, 192 people died in Franklin County because of the tornado. In Hamilton and White counties, it also killed 45 people initially and injured 140, 29 of whom later died as well from their injuries. In Hamilton County, it reached a peak width of 1.5 miles across and devoured dozens of homes, farms, churches, schools, and many other structures that were in its path, along with any people who were in its path, sweeping them away and leveling the trees that it didn't just snap or throw. 28 more people were killed, and of the injured, 9 later died as well. The tornado just seemed to have no end. It just kept going. It passed Carmi without a hit and had an even closer shave with Enfield, and Corsville, missing these communities by a few hundred yards. Still in this area, 18 more people were killed and 11 more later died of their injuries. This is around the time that the artist reconstruction of the tornado I've shown in this video is set. You can see how hard it was for people to see that it was a tornado. Even the weather wise could have hardly tell it was a tornado. Shortly after this, leaving its path of twisted, tattered ruins and wreckage in Illinois, crossed another river, the Wabash River, and it entered the third state, Indiana. On screen is an image of a tornado from the 1970s. Survivors of the tri-state tornado said that this is close to what they saw that day. Some said they saw that black wall of slow-rolling fog crawling over the land, but others who saw it reported an appearance like this. I'll touch on the debate of the tornado's true appearance later, but for now, this is a great visual to give you an idea of what the tornado looked like. Specifically, the tornado as it entered Indiana. The tornado by now has entered the state. Witnesses not in the path around this time reported seeing the wedge pass, accompanied by possibly 6 satellite tornadoes, or perhaps more likely 6 subvortices, but who knows for sure. My opinion is that there were 6 or so multiple vortices. Several dead men were walking into these communities by now. Mary McIntyre lived in Griffin, Indiana. She described the tornado as, "It wasn't black, it was the darkest blue I ever saw in the clouds," when she saw it from the schoolhouse that afternoon. When she saw it, she thought, "Oh, we're just gonna drown." Her and her father raced home, her father recounting that, "When I was 7 years old, there was a big storm and it looked just like this." Miss McIntyre also described, "You couldn't see a thing. It was just as black as it could get, and the wind was so hard." Other witnesses in Griffin described the tornado as having 2 or 3 funnels, a multi-vortex tornado. No doubt in my mind that the dead man was indeed walking. Grazing across the northmost edge of Posey County, Indiana, the tornado essentially devoured Griffin whole, adding it to the already long list of towns that it had completely demolished. No single structure in Griffin was untouched. The total who died in the storm or the aftermath was 46. One of those killed was a boy, according to Mary McIntyre again. He had been walking towards the town, and they found him dead out in the field. I don't know what happened, whether something hit him in the head or it was because he got blown around like that, but he was almost to Griffin when it overtook him. Another of those killed was one of the children in the schoolhouse. One little boy was killed in the schoolhouse, Mary said. He was waiting there because we just had the one bus and it had 2 routes. The driver would make one route and then come in and make the other. It seemed that this boy got behind a door back in that little corner place as you closed the door, and I guess he thought that would be more secure. But the bricks piled in on top of him and killed him. Ted McIntyre added, "It was the grace of God. I tell Mary, it's a miracle that it didn't kill everybody. How it demolished that bus and didn't kill more of them children that it did. It's just hard to believe." Witnesses in Griffin claimed to see the tornado rip apart into 3 and merge back into 1 again as it moved over the town. After leaving Griffin, the tornado shifted to the northeast and moved into Gibson County. Rural areas were devastated, and the northwestmost corner of Owensville was struck where 9 lost their lives. Next, the tornado raced into Princeton, injuring over 150 people, killing 38 originally, but an additional 6 died of their injuries later. A Heinz factory in Princeton was damaged, neighborhoods in the city were swept away, and the tornado kept going. In Princeton, people described the tornado as a rolling barrel, black as coal. From there, it crossed into Pike County and finally died at around 4:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. The killer was finally gone, dissipating and melting into nothing, leaving an unbroken, damaged path across 3 states and near untold levels of human suffering in its wake. Today in Griffin is a historical marker dedicated to remembering the tornado. It reads on the front, at 4 p.m. on March 18th, 1925, a tornado arrived in Indiana after devastating parts of Missouri and Illinois. The town of Griffin was destroyed. The Owensville area and Princeton suffered heavy losses. Hundreds were injured. 76 were killed. Within hours, help came from nearby towns, the American Red Cross, and the Indiana National Guard. And on the back, heavy rains caused the Wabash River to flood, and by March 23, 1925, the only way to reach Griffin was by boat or railroad. Within weeks, Griffin was slowly being rebuilt. After a year, much of the town was rebuilt, including a schoolhouse, one church, and a grain elevator. This tornado is still rated the deadliest in U.S. weather history. You know, not too long ago, I talked about the Natchez tornado. And until this one, that was the deadliest tornado in U.S. history. This, however, was something else altogether in its scale and duration. Not comparing two absolutely horrific events or anything. That would be like comparing the sinking of the Titanic to the SS Arctic, but there is a reason this tornado has such an infamous legacy and name. It's the Titanic of tornadoes. It's the one everybody knows about, or at least knows the name of. There's a reason why it is still whispered about or talked about as if it was a legend, with some awe. And a scary idea, there might have been someone who saw both these tornadoes in their lives. It's possible. They occurred only 84 years apart, give or take. As I pointed out in the Natchez video, the sinking of the Titanic and the release of James Cameron's movie was more or less the same amount of time that occurred between these two tornadoes. It very much could and likely was still living memory at the time of Tri-State. However, even Tri-State has now passed from living memory. However, it seared a vivid path through history as effectively as it seared a path of damage across 3 states. The final victim of the Tri-State tornado died almost a year later. The tornado lingered over 46-year-old coal miner Gervais Burgess until he died from injuries he sustained during the tornado on January 3rd, 1926. With that, the tornado claimed its final known victim. I'll briefly touch on the rest of the outbreak as well, but I may save most of the details about it for another video because there were a lot of tornadoes on March 18th, 1925. Just no others like the big one. Tornadoes struck Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Alabama, and Tennessee. There were at least 12 confirmed tornadoes of varying strength, some significant enough to receive an F4 rating decades later, and there were likely several others too that left no real impact, and thus are lost tornadoes. Monroe to Vernon Township areas in Indiana were struck by a powerful but unrated tornado that was likely a continuation of the Tri-State family. It reportedly caused significant damage to homes and communities in rural areas. There were 2 tornadoes that have received an F4 rating from this storm. One struck Indiana and Kentucky, and it was described as a large, powerful tornado that obliterated entire farmsteads near Laconia and Elizabeth, Indiana. A swath of space 2 blocks wide was leveled by this tornado near the Ohio River in what is now Pleasure Ridge Park. And I wonder if any signs of it are still there. Smaller trees that grew back in the years or something like that. This F4 caused 4 deaths and injured 60 people. The second F4 struck Tennessee and Kentucky and killed 41 and injured 95. This tornado was described as exceptionally violent. It completely swept away homes and churches, and among those killed in Tennessee were 8 members of one family. Bodies of many people were found across Tennessee, torn apart and dismembered hundreds of yards from their home sites, and significant ground scouring occurred from this tornado. It crossed hills, valleys, forests, and retained its strength no matter the terrain, leaving forests leveled and the very earth scarred. The only tornado to strike Alabama was an F2. It killed one person and destroyed a store, a filling station, and some homes, injuring 12 before dying itself. All of these tornadoes have been overshadowed by the sheer scale, power, and duration of the tri-state tornado. None of them were even close to it in duration, fatality numbers, and sheer overall destruction. None of them share the legacy of the tri-state tornado. Many people think the tri-state tornado was alone, but no, it had many just as sinister but shorter-lived siblings. It, however, drowned them all out. Even among the many tornadoes that day, tri-state was still a uniquely powerful tornado unlike any of the others that roared across the United States on March 18th, 1925. Even unlike most others that had ever struck the United States in all of its recorded history up to that time. What is there to say after hearing all of that? It was the worst kind of never-ending story. Town after town destroyed without pause, a true glimpse into the power of nature. I've known about the tri-state tornado pretty much my whole life, but it was like a legend. Heck, I live not too far from where it died, but growing up, it was like this far-off apocalyptic event. Tornado chasers or fans, whispered about a tornado that tore apart 3 states, including my own, before dying after leaving a trail of destruction behind it, which might have been one of the reasons my imagination was so captivated by it by a very young age. Growing up, there wasn't too many historical events, I ever read about that occurred in Indiana, but this one did. And I think that's maybe one reason why it caught my attention from such a young age. It affected somewhere I knew. But despite knowing about it for so long, this was the first time I'd really ever read through the full story, or I guess a portion of it. I didn't read through the whole story. The tornado affected too many people to reasonably do that in a single video. To this day, this tornado is still referenced in all kinds of things. Modern tornadoes even get sometimes called things like the tri-state tornado of our era, or, the tri-state tornado of so-and-so year, or something similar, so on. My opinion on all this is that the tri-state tornado was a single tornado, not multiple, and that it was a uniquely rare phenomenon. A rare, once in a century or 2 centuries alignment of everything in the very worst way possible it could be. Maybe something exactly like it we haven't even seen since it could be so rare. Again, I'm not a meteorologist, but you don't see these kinds of conditions often. It was a literal perfect storm when everything that cooks up a tornado was on the table and all came together for the ultimate tornado recipe. It's still an infamous name, even a century later. If you read about tornadoes even casually, you'll probably hear about it quickly. Heck, it's no secret that even the late, great Bill Paxton wanted to make a sequel to Twister directly inspired by this tornado event. So the aftermath of the storm itself. The aftermath included horrific details such as destroyed homes filled with eviscerated and shredded corpses of families, schools filled with dismembered children, bodies hanging from trees and utility lines, some areas so filled with gore that responders could not tell what was human and what was animal remains. And one account I heard a while ago that always stuck in my mind is from a friend of the person remembering the event, who, I guess, take this with a grain of salt, because I've never seen if this has been confirmed to have occurred, but it's a story that's always associated with the tri-state tornado that is at least worth giving a mention to, because it's horrifying. So as I said, a friend of the person remembering the event is the one who this account comes from, but according to her, when her friend got home, she found the house gone, and an open field in its place, and in the middle was sitting her grandmother, sitting in her rocking chair like she always did, only she didn't have a head. That is a bit of an urban legend associated with the tri-state tornado. If it's true, I've actually never been able to see confirmed one way or another. Other people, in some cases, children crawling out of destroyed schools, wandered home in shock to find their homes just gone. In Illinois, a physician team pulled a train into the demolished village Thompsonville. It was loaded to capacity with the injured, dying, and dead before it made it to a hospital in Benton. In Griffin, Indiana, relief also came by train, arriving from both Evansville and Illinois. The Red Cross and Salvation Army also responded to affected areas in the immediate aftermath, doing all they could to help survivors, many of whom had lost everything. Many of the survivors, since their towns were literally wiped off the earth, began living in tent cities. One story of the aftermath in The Tri-State Tornado by Peter Faulkner that caught my attention when I read it was the death of Louis Galdoni. His death brought to light that he and a Miss Grace Harrell had gone to DeSoto on January 23rd and were secretly married there. Honestly, so many of the aftermath stories are like a scene from an End of Days movie. Blanche Gieselman said, "I kept hearing a baby cry down the road by the schoolhouse. They got to hunting for it and it was in a ditch, so covered with mud that they couldn't find it." The baby was okay once they got it cleaned up, but the strange part, nobody in the area had a baby, and Blanche didn't know if it was ever determined who the child belonged to or where it had come from. Myrtle Marr from West Frankfort described what she saw of the aftermath when a family who lived behind them came to their family home for help. Now she, the neighbor, had a baby, but whether it was injured or not, I can't remember, but she came carrying the baby and dragging her husband over to our house. He had a broken leg and she had, you know what a piece of a 2x4 lumber looks like? Well, it looked like half of that, a piece about 2 inches square, in her jaw, embedded in her face. I took them down in our basement. We had a basement, but I never thought of going to the basement until then. And I took them down there till people came and got them. Wynneth Jones's account of the aftermath was, "Our home was completely destroyed. One wall of the kitchen, the north one, was leaning out, about to fall, and our cabinet was leaning with it. The rest was swept clean down to the floor with part of the foundation knocked in. There were dead horses, pigs, chickens, and dogs, cats, birds laying everywhere. We all survived, but it was a miracle, because when I looked at the kitchen area after the storm, I saw chunks of chimney and 3 or 4 foot sections lying all about. Despite that, no one in the house had been hit by any of the debris." One slightly more lighthearted account from the same book was from Garrett Cruz, whose father raised show chickens, or fancy chickens as he put it. "Our chicken house was one of the buildings which was destroyed by being more or less just flattened where it stood. As my brother was removing the remains of this building, he found one of the Rhode Island hens trapped there, still alive after approximately 2 weeks without food or water. His brother took the bird home, and the hen survived, no worse for wear after the experience. He added that amid the rubble, they found a box full of the eggs these special show chickens had laid as well, and not a single one was broken." Garrett Cruz also commented, "There was a lot of weird things that happened, but stories such as the one about a cast iron kettle being turned inside out without breaking, you don't want to believe things like that." Outside of the tornado's path, many did not realize what they had been spared from. Some accounts described people crying that their drying clothes had been blown off the lines, not grasping the horrors that were happening, in some cases, literally just down the street. Over 600 people were injured in Illinois alone. Most of the fatalities occurred here too. And, in total, the number of people who died from the tri-state tornado was 695 confirmed fatalities. Natchez, the second deadliest, was somewhere around 317 confirmed dead, though the number was definitely higher in that one. Just going by off the official numbers, though, The tri-state tornado essentially doubled that. Over 50 of those killed were the usually weather-aware farmers, perhaps an indicator of just how untornado-like this tornado appeared. The tri-state tornado was on the ground for almost 4 hours, for 219 miles, injured more than 2,000 people, and destroyed 15,000 homes. And as I mentioned, the tri-state tornado outbreak as a whole saw more than just this single long-track tornado. There were 2 F4s, 4 F3s, 2 F2s, and an unknown number of F0 and F1 tornadoes. It probably won't be a surprise, but the tri-state tornado today is rated as an F5. Though it was never officially rated by NOAA, its F5 status is pretty much universally recognized, and it is still the deadliest tornado in U.S. history. The tri-state tornado outbreak as a whole likely killed more than 750 people and injured somewhere around 2,300 in total. Some places never rebuilt. Here is a picture of a spot where the tornado hit. In 1925, there was a road and several homes here. No one was left to rebuild here after most of it was wiped away, and today nothing, not even a visible roadbed, is left, forever wiped off the earth by the tornado and the span of time that has passed since. Today, the area is empty farmland. If you try to follow maps of roads from 1925, many of the roads on them no longer exist because of this tornado wiping out everything that was alongside them. One article I read had a quote that I really liked. It basically said, "The lingering scars of the tri-state tornado today are not the ones you can see, like a clear damage path still cut through the countryside, but rather the scars that still remain today are what is no longer there. Many homes were never rebuilt along the path of the tornado. In some cases, no one was left to rebuild." The same article said, quote, "In other places, you still find field roads disappearing where a house once stood. 2 miles up the road from Newman School, one of these field roads leads to where the next school along this road was located." End quote. In some places along the path, many of the trees are not from before March 18th, 1925. On screen now are the remains of the old crossroads where the Fitzgerald family home stood. It was the last house destroyed in Illinois before the tornado crossed into Indiana. A lingering scar today is not what is here, but what is not here anymore. It's a haunting way to think about the tornado. In some ways, some places never healed. All that was left of those who lived here were the memories, and those too are now all but faded. I've never thought about the most lasting tornado scars being what is not there anymore, after the damage path itself was cleaned, healed, and gone. The same article did show one picture of a flower still growing in the place where a home was destroyed and never rebuilt. A kind of flower planted at home sites. For the last century, they have grown back every year, though the house and family are long gone. Despite no photos of the tornado or film reels of the tornado having ever turned up, well, I have seen unconfirmed accounts from randoms online that some existed but were destroyed, but I'd take that with more than just a grain of salt. I'd take that with a full 3-course meal of nothing but salt. The descriptions of the tornado are vivid, and though they can't make up for the lack of pictures, I have touched on them many times, and they're unique sounding. Boiling clouds on the ground or amorphous rolling fog. The description, like a black fog rolling over the hills, has struck with me vividly ever since I first heard it and just captures my imagination. The shape just didn't catch people off guard. How big it was did too. When he saw it, Eugene Porter said, "It was so wide. Usually you think about a tornado, it has a funnel and it may be just a block or 2 or 3 blocks wide, but something about a mile wide? Well, it just..." He trailed off there, but you get the idea, and these untornado-like appearances fooled many people who knew what to look out for if a tornado was coming into thinking all was well. Honestly, look at this. Does that look like a tornado or a wall of low clouds or fog? Look how dark it is. Once again, this is the Hackleburg tornado. I have it on screen now, and I did right before this image too, and it is often compared to the description of the tri-state tornado. And I mean, look at this. Go back and look again at the picture before this one. If you didn't know that was a tornado, would you think that that is a tornado? I would definitely support that for at least part of its life. The tornado was rain wrapped, but it was also at times probably surrounded by dust, river mud, low clouds, and debris. But I also agree that this is probably the closest modern example to how the tornado looked when some of those descriptions of it looking like a black fog or low clouds were witnessed by survivors. And honestly, this is not only one of the scariest images I have ever seen of a tornado, but it's just horrific. It's apocalyptic. This image is from the middle of the afternoon, and look how dark it is. However, I'm going to go on a quick tangent here and say that I will defer to what actual survivors said it looked like instead of my interpretation 100 years later. Tangent time, everyone. I'm going to discuss what I think it looked like, what survivors said it looked like, and what the internet thinks, and let you make your own conclusions. It's kind of the whole philosophy of mine. I let the viewers make their own conclusions, but I'm going to, be obvious. First, I wasn't there. The survivors were. They saw it. All I saw is what they described to have seen, and I have my own interpretation. Actual survivors said this tornado on screen looked just like the wall of gray fog they saw that day. So it is likely that the closest another tornado has come to its appearance is this one. Do I think Hackleburg matches the description? Oh, absolutely. Can I say that it looked like the tri-state tornado? No. In my opinion, it probably looked very similar, but I can't claim to know. Were survivors shown this exact image on screen now, and did they say that this was what they saw on March 18th, 1925? Yes, they were and did. This is the 1979 Wichita Falls F4 tornado, perhaps the best example of what the tri-state tornado looked like for at least part of its life, according to those who were there. Now, can I assume and theorize about its appearance? Yes. Can I say for sure I'm right? No. Do I personally think the Hackleburg Phil Campbell tornado is a very close idea to what the tri-state tornado probably looked like for a majority of its life? Absolutely. Can I say that as a fact? No. The only tornado that we can truly say looks like the tri-state tornado is the Wichita Falls F4, because that is the one survivors said looked like the tornado they saw in 1925. Several survivors were shown this picture in a lineup, and a majority of them picked this picture out as the one that looked the most like the tri-state tornado. This lineup of survivors occurred in 2008 and was part of a study done by Dr. Charles Doswell. However, it should be pointed out that these survivors were ones who mostly saw the tornado in Indiana. A valid and true thing to remember and consider here is that throughout its life, it appeared very different. From start to end, the tornado took many forms and shapes. It wasn't static. It went from a funnel to a wedge to a boiling wall of fog-like clouds throughout its life. My personal belief is that this is what it looked like while in Indiana for the most part, or as it was nearing the end of its life. A more visible traditional wedge, though still darker colored than this image, since witnesses in Indiana still reported the black color. I think in Indiana it was still darker than this image, but more visible than, say, in Illinois. But the black rain-wrapped fog-like wedge, hardly resembling a tornado, is what tore across Illinois. At that point, I'd argue it likely did resemble the images I showed of the Hackleburg tornado a lot more. Again, look back at those two images from a few minutes ago. But that's just my personal opinion. I wasn't there and won't claim what people saw who were there. I won't claim to know more than what the people who actually saw it did. But the descriptions are eerily similar, especially to the pictures I showed earlier. That second one matches the tri-state tornado to a T, and it's one of the most nightmarish pictures of a tornado I have ever seen, and it matches the most nightmarish tri-state descriptions too. There is certainly an argument to be made as well that if the survivors had lived long enough to be shown images of the Hackleburg tornado, or if any that were left after it struck were shown pictures of it, then they might have pointed to it instead of Wichita Falls. But as it stands, Wichita Falls is the one survivors pointed out as being the closest to the appearance of the tri-state tornado in their lifetimes. Again, my personal opinion is Hackleburg definitely eerily resembles the tri-state tornado more from what I've seen of it, but from what witnesses described, I'm going to defer to them. Anyway, that was my 2 cents. I personally think the conversation of the true appearance of the tri-state tornado is a fascinating, ongoing one. Also, while we're discussing its appearance, the lack of pictures is what makes debating it so prevalent. I want to take a moment to debunk this image right here. Some claim that this is a genuine photo of the tri-state tornado. It is not. This is an edited photo of the same Wichita Falls tornado. This image is sometimes passed around as a genuine tri-state tornado picture, but as I've said, none are known to exist. Now, I do also love this artist's depiction of it a lot. It doesn't even look like a tornado. Again, just like the image I had on screen moments before, this just looks like black, low clouds close to the ground. It's horrifying. Now, I did also touch on it, but there is another debate about the tri-state tornado, and this time it's on if the tornado was a single long-track tornado or not. I personally believe it was, as I said, and I think this tornado was essentially a rare freak of nature that happened because everything lined up so perfectly. As I said earlier, it might be a thing that happens, once a century or once every 2 centuries or something like that. And I will say, going off the descriptions of it, that the tri-state tornado is probably one of the scariest tornadoes I have ever talked about just when it comes to its truly nightmarish appearance, let alone all the destruction it did on top of that. There are arguments that it was a family of tornadoes and not a single tornado, but personally, I think it was a single long-tracked tornado. Maybe the first small funnel that people saw was another tornado. I would almost argue it was. There is a jump in the damage path around there, but for the most part, while that giant wall of black fog was on the ground, the tornado path was reportedly continuous and unbroken. Plus, we know from the 2021 tri-state tornado that tornadoes can be on the ground for several hundred miles. So I think the 1925 tri-state tornado was one long-tracked tornado. What do you think, though? I would love to know. This is another fascinating debate people have. And the same for its appearance. Do you think it looked like the Hackleburg Phil Campbell tornado? Or do you think the Wichita Falls is closer? Or is there another one that you think is a more likely candidate? Again, I'd love to know. And remember that though this was a century ago, and we're so far removed from it now, that this happened to people and it changed them forever. Eugene Porter said, "It completely changed my life. In fact, when we talked before the tornado and after the tornado. It was a milestone." And that was the story of the tri-state tornado. I always knew that this would be one that I had to talk about after I started doing tornado videos, but something in me never moved forward with doing a video on it. Even after I got Peter's book specifically to do a video on it, there was something in me that never went forward with it. I always wanted to do a big project on this tornado. It's like the tornado. And I think I was waiting for this day. I think I was waiting to talk about it on the day that it happened, and I think that was the right choice. I think talking about it the day it happened was the right move. And also, the 100th anniversary of it happening just felt like the right time. That was the story. Not the whole story, just some of it. A piece, a glimpse of the great American tornado from 100 years ago. What did you think of it? I see why it became almost a legend, and honestly, it's still surreal to think this happened. From one tornado to a tornado event on this scale is still almost unheard of. The tri-state tornado was an extraordinary thing, a freak of nature, spawned from that rare alignment of conditions, and it lives up to its legend. The visual of entire communities vanishing into this wall of rolling fog only to appear again on the other side wiped away is chilling to imagine. Today, would this tornado be as impactful? Maybe not. For better or worse, I don't think it would. Because we not only know more about tornadoes now, but we also have better warning systems in place. If Hackleberg is a good comparison, at least people were warned that it was coming. If anything, stories like this one, though, have helped us get to this point. And we should be so grateful for the fact that at any time we can open our phones and see where a tornado warning is as it's happening. That's something that a majority of humans have not been lucky enough to have. Another tri-state tornado did strike in 2021 on December 10th, and while devastating, there was a chance for people to be warned at the least. I'll link my video talking about the 2021 tri-state tornado in one of the end cards. And another tornado I've seen tri-state get compared to, strength-wise, is the Smithville tornado, the overlooked but crazy powerful EF5 from 2011. I'll link my video about that one at the end as well. Finally, I'd like to say, let's take a moment today to forget comparing it to others or debating what it looked like, and instead think about what happened 100 years ago and the people it affected, just as the people of Murfreesboro are doing today. And honestly, if I had the current means to have gone over there for the event today, I would have loved to go. If you did and are even watching this there, that's awesome. If you sat through this whole video, which is way longer than I guessed it would be, then thank you so much for watching. If there's a tornado that lives in your mind rent-free, like this one does for so many people, please tell me about it, and there is a good chance I'll talk about it. Does this tornado have the same impression on you as it does for so many people? Did any of your family survive this tornado? I'd love to know. If there's any stories from the tri-state tornado that you know about that I didn't cover in this video, please, I'd love to see them shared. And finally, just tell me what you think of the tri-state tornado. If you want to learn more about it and read more stories from it, I highly recommend you track down Peter Falconer's book. If you saw my big Titanic anniversary video last year, you know I included all kinds of personal accounts from On a Sea of Glass and saying nothing but praise for it. And I used his book in a very similar way for this video, and it was a very similar type of work, and I again sing nothing but praise for how much info and use it proved to contain. It has so many first-hand accounts from the storm and what people experienced, far more than I included in this video. This video was a huge undertaking, it really was, but for the 100th anniversary, it was more than worth it. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please check out my other tornado videos. Give this one a like and subscribe if you want to see more, because it helps me as a small creator grow and tells me that you did enjoy it and you want more like it. Thank you all again for watching, and have a good one, everyone.